This week, as the nation anticipated the announcement of a grand jury decision in the Ferguson, Missouri police shooting, Rocky Mountain PBS News is taking another look at the ongoing series Losing Ground, the data analysis that we first presented last year about the gaps in equality of opportunity and outcomes for people of color in Colorado. These gaps have developed since the early 1980s, when many of the gains of the civil rights era started to erode. And you can see some very well-made charts showing the gaps at rmpbs.org/news, and especially in some key areas like the overall poverty rate, the number of each and racial group who have achieved high school or college degrees, as well as things like home ownership and family income and how those are different across racial lines. Tonight, I'm also glad to have three young Coloradans to talk with us about these data and also just what else they are seeing from where they sit in the community. Delise Collins is a designer, a small business owner, a mother. She's been married since she was 16 and also a youth pastor. Sean Bradley is also a father. He married a little later, started a family a little later, and he and his wife have a consultancy where they work on a number of diverse public and private projects. And then Maki Lucero, who is, among many other things, the grandson of Rudolfo Corky Gonzalez, well-known civil rights practitioner and fighter here in Denver in the 70s. So it is wonderful to have each of you here, and I think I'd just like to have you say a little bit more about yourself so that the audience can understand where you are in this community. You grew up where, Sean?
I grew up in Texas. I grew up in a small town called Dangerfield, Texas. It's in the rural part of Northeast Texas. Some of you have more friends on your Facebook page than I have in my entire town. But it's a wonderful community. I learned a lot from my grandparents, from my friends, my mom, just family members. I moved here a little over 10 years ago to go to law school and to finish my master's degree. Had a chance to work in the state capitol, and oftentimes I tell people that, I love this city, and I found love in this city when I got a chance to meet my wife, Volita, and we have two great boys and very engaged in our community. We're both part of a fraternity and sorority organizations. I'm a Kappa Alpha Psi member. She's a member of AKA, or Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. So we're very involved. The purpose that we do, not just in our business ventures, but in our private lives, is just to serve our community and do what we can to help others who need help the most.
Maki Lucero, you inherited sort of a community interest and a legacy, really, that you carry on from your grandfather. Tell us a little bit more about what you do, though, in life.
So I run a couple businesses. One's an entertainment business. The other is an IT solutions business. Through both of them, we try to give back to the community, working with nonprofits and smaller organizations. And on the entertainment side, going and performing for youth organizations, schools, and working directly with youth organizations to provide services that are in line with the entertainment kind of model. So, teaching audio engineering, digital marketing, things of that nature, and helping the kids kind of get prepared for the direction they're going.
I bet a lot of them are drawn to those things.
Definitely. We have a lot of interest from the youth. They all want to be musicians or actors and things of that nature. So we try to provide them with some of the knowledge to equip them to go into that industry.
Well, as it happens, Delise is an actor who started down that road and then decided to diverge to another one. Yes. Delise, tell us more about you.
Okay, well, I grew up here in Denver. We moved to Aurora when I was a teenager. Moved away to Las Vegas for about 5 years, and I drug my husband and our son with us. They were not very happy about it. We stayed there for a little while so that I could pursue acting. I did a lot of local theater there. I did some modeling, had some really good experiences, but also some very great awakenings that led me back to Colorado, realizing that who I really am at my core has nothing to do with seeking fame and attention, but really being in the background, helping youth learn who they are. So we moved back to Colorado. We found an amazing congregation called Simchat Torah Beit Midrash, which is Hebrew for the joy of God's teaching and instruction, house of study. And my husband and I are youth pastors there. We own a business called Clear Cut Window Tinting. We do window tint. We put clear brow paint protection on vehicles, and I'm also a designer that helps install decals and stickers.
Thank you all so much. So what we have here is three young people who are concerned about the building of the community and the way that the youth in the community are able to live out their lives in the best way possible. So that naturally, makes you kind of experts on how communities react to certain things. Let's turn right to Ferguson. As we've been waiting for this grand jury verdict, we're taping, of course, before we know what it is. But what concerns you the most, or what strikes you the most about it, Sean?
Well, one is, and I'm afraid, that I want my kids to grow up in a community where they're always going to be safe, regardless of if it's their neighbor or if it's a police officer, my friends. Just want them to grow up in a safe neighborhood, safe community. I'm afraid that too many times in our neighborhoods, we're so divided in our community. Ferguson has 21,000 people that live in their community. And on one side of the street, you have families who have bad schools and bad stores and terrible ways of living their lives. And the other side, they have great parks and great walking facilities, bike routes and bike stores, great restaurants. These kids go to the same schools, and yet they cheer for each other on Friday nights, and then on Saturday they go back to the way they've lived. And I don't want my kids, I don't want Aiden and Jackson to grow up in a community like that, and it's a fearful thing for us. I mean, another thing is our right to participate in our activities, our voting. And we had some conversation about this earlier. But I'm not sure, but most people know that there's over 280 million people in this country who are registered to vote. In this last election cycle, less than 85 million people actually participate in our election cycles.
That's just a travesty. People
it's a huge number, and there's some discussions that I think we can have. But I'm fearful of the lack of participation in our communities, and I'm also fearful of the safety in our communities and how we bring each other together. And hopefully, as a person of faith, that something good will come out of this, that there'll be lessons learned from all of us.
Lucky, say more on that, will you? As you grew up and as this younger generation, removed from what your father and his colleagues were doing at the time, did you find a struggle, or did you more often find that you were glad the struggle had been undertaken by your grandfather?
I mean, there's always been a struggle. I think a lot of the ills that they suffered in the 60s and 70s, we still suffered and transitioned into modern day society here. I think a big thing what Sean had said is that the division in communities is why we have a lot of the problems of coming together and controlling our communities, because on one side you have people with nothing, on the other side you have people with a lot, and they're going to the same schools, and they're ultimately divided by a stature, so even though we're of the same, cut from the same cloth, same color, same race, we have division based on your parents, work a good job, and these parents live in the projects, So, I mean,
kind of social pressure that just can't, that's going to come up, right?
And I think the root problems still need to be addressed today, why we have that lower class mentality and why we even have that separation, and that's, the inadequate housing, the inadequate schooling. We have a lot of people out of work. We're not prepared to go into a, how do I say it? Into more of the modern day kind of business society. We're not
21st century economy.
We're not taught to dot our I's or cross our T's. When you come from a background, instead you're a lower class background, you're taught to work a 9-to-5 job. You're not taught how to fill out a college application or financial aid. And I think that gives the reason why we have so many people who are in the lower class and so many people who are still growing up in gangs and going through the same problems that the civil rights era was fighting in the 60s and 70s.
Delise, let me bring you into this. Because you spent time in and out of Colorado, is it fair to say that Colorado, the Denver area, is better off than Ferguson, Missouri, in terms of the divide?
Better off.
In that there's not one street where everybody below this street works, has a certain income, and everybody above is better equipped, like Sean was discussing?
I would say that today's Colorado versus 20, 30, 50 years ago, we're much more diversified in that we have blacks and whites and Hispanics living next to each other as neighbors. I mean, we can see with the regentrification of the 5 Points area. I was just down there weeks ago, and I saw people of all backgrounds, walking up and down the streets, and it was so amazing to me to see that we're coming together in that way. As far as,
does it go beyond the way it looks?
oh, definitely. It's much deeper. The surface of what things appear to be, there's always an underlying issues and root causes to everything else that's going on. And Ferguson might be at more of a disparity in the separation between, their high class, middle class, and lower income citizens than we are here in Colorado. Do I see that as an excuse for the rioting and the actions that our culture is participating in that side of the country? I definitely do not. We were speaking about this earlier, and I believe that we put ourselves at odds. We really are the ones, as black and brown, whatever you want to call it, that bring the separation from the higher class.
Sean, you have these two boys. You have a teenager, Delise. Manny isn't exactly that far along in his career, but it is, I'm sure, for your children that you worry about how this all goes in the future. And I've heard so many times now, Sean, about how fathers have to teach young black men to keep your hands on the wheel if you're stopped by the police, and don't make a ruckus. Is that how you were taught? Is that what you're going to have to teach your kids?
I hope not. I mean, it was something that was, I grew up in Deep East Texas. I mean, I grew up not very far from the James Byrd incident where I went to college, when James Byrd was drugged to his death.
Oh, that's right.
And so there's a lot of history in where I grew up. And sure, there were times where our parents taught us not to stop a police officer stopped you, but to go to a lighted area, to drive slowly and allow them to follow you and go to the nearest convenience store, to the next gas station, or to the next grocery store. I don't want my kids to have to grow up in a city like that, and I don't want my kids to have to grow up in a community like that. It's serious when we do these things, and I hope that I can teach Aiden and Jackson and others, who are part of our Guy Rat and our Cap League programs with our fraternity, that your actions speak louder than your words, and there are consequences to your actions, and that if you're not careful, if you're not safe, if you're not doing the right thing, we can unfortunately find ourselves having these type of conversations today, exactly. Unfortunately.
Is that what, say, when you first heard about Ferguson, what went through your mind, Delise?
I thought Rodney King and LA was the first thing that went through my mind. And please, Lord, don't let us do the same things that we did back then. In so many ways, the context and even the catalyst of what started Ferguson is just right in line with Rodney King and the LA riots. And when you research the background of the person who was the victim, what choices were they making in their life? Like what you just said, Sean. What did they do right before the cops, took authority over them? And unfortunately in Ferguson, this young man had to lose his life. But he wasn't picking lilies on the corner. He had just left from committing a crime, and there is a consequence for everything that you do. And for my young black son, whom is 15, Jaden, I don't tell him to be afraid when he gets pulled over and to keep his hands on the wheel, face forward. My dad is actually a commander for District 5 Denver, and he's a black man. And I tell my son that your attitude and what you're doing in your life is going to bring a consequence. And if you're pulled over by an officer, you give them the utmost respect no matter what race they are, because your attitude is going to attract either that positive attention or the negative attention from law enforcement, or anyone for that matter.
Maki, you mentioned about gangs in certain communities and so forth. Is it true that, I guess what I'm thinking when I listen to what Delise just said is that, yes, you can, there's so much of it that you can do, which is to be respectful and not give anybody, an officer, a chance to think you're doing something wrong, but isn't it true that some kids feel like they are just pulled over because they are who they are and they're on the street?
Yeah, I think they are, and I think the respect goes both ways. You know, I went to Horseman Middle School in North Denver, which is near the Quig Newton projects, and you know, I wasn't involved in gangs or anything like that. You know, I was way too young for that, 6th, 7th grade. But at least once a week on our way home, we got stopped by the cops, and they would check our backpacks and pockets and so on and so forth. And we're young kids, you know. So there definitely is a climate of prejudice between lower class citizens and police officers. I think it's still prevalent today, and regardless of what the young man in Ferguson was doing, I don't think that his consequence should have been losing his life. You know, I think that we do make choices, and there is there's a cause and effect. You know, you do something, of course something's going to happen. You know, and you have to deal with what happens when you choose to commit a crime. But on one end, I don't think that he deserved to lose his life, and I don't think that who he is at 15 or 16 would have reflected who maybe he would have been at 30 years old. You know, you're a kid, you're making bad decisions because that's what kids do. Of course, hopefully we're taught not to make those bad decisions at homes, but sometimes you just learn things out there in the streets, or you learn things at school, and you know, it kind of shadows into your life. And you know, it's not necessarily saying that that's who the young man was going to be 30 years from now, you know.
That's exactly
But he didn't
right.
get a chance to figure out who he was going to be.
Totally agree.
So thank you to Sean Bradley, Delise Collins, and Maki Lucero for a very interesting conversation. We'll hope to hear from all of you again. That is Colorado State of Mind for this weekend. You may see the program again at video.rmpbs.org. And next week, join us for another edition. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Good night.